Okay, so we're now in public session, so we're moving to item number 5 on the agenda, the draft minutes. Can I refer everybody to the draft minutes of proceedings, page 457 of the meeting pack? Everybody content that the draft minutes of the meeting are of the 9th of January are a true reflection of the proceedings? Content? Okay, thank you. Number 6 then, matters arising, refer members to the correspondence issued to the Paymaster General Minister of the Cabinet Office, Nick Thomas Simmons. So following our discussion last week, we sent this letter about the operation of the committee, and that can be found at pages 472 of our meeting pack. Is everybody content to note that?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So we're now moving on to item number 7 in the CLAR, which is the EU Regulation 2025/14 on the approval and market surveillance of non-road mobile machinery circulating on public roads. So we're going to have departmental oral evidence. Just to let you know, Hansard are going to record this item. So British government notified us, or notification indicated that it relates only to Article 51 of the regulation, so only this article is under consideration. The relevant papers are at page 6 of the meeting pack. The Department for Infrastructure's assessment of impact is at page 61 of the meeting pack, and the committee will need to make a decision on whether to hold an inquiry to do so after this. So we have Adrian in front of us, Adrian Borland, Head of Vehicle Policy Branch from the Department for Infrastructure. So Adrian, over to yourself.
Thank you, Chair. So the main purpose of regulation EU 2025/14 is to create a new type approval framework in the EU for road-going self-propelled machinery which is similar to the current EU type approval frameworks for cars, tractors, motorcycles. Non-road mobile machinery, broad category, covers mobile machines which are regularly used in construction, agriculture, gardening, municipal material handling sectors. Occasionally, some of that machinery will need to circulate on public roads, mostly to move from one working place to another. So we're talking about mobile machinery here like combine harvesters, diggers, excavators, forklift trucks, ride-on mowing machines. The committee will be aware that the existing vehicular EU type approval framework regulations apply here since they're listed in Annex 2 of the protocol. Regulation 2025/14 is, however, not listed, doesn't fall within the scope of the protocol, with the one exception, as the Chair's pointed out. So accordingly, only Article 51 qualifies as amending legislation under the protocol and is covered by this DSC notification. So the amendment being made by Article 51 is to update Annex 1 of the Market Surveillance Regulation EU 2019-1020, which does fall within the scope of the protocol. To reference, what it does is references Regulation 2025/14 in the list of regulations that are covered by it. This adding of Regulation 2025/14 to Annex 1 of the Market Surveillance Regulation is a standard administrative amendment carried out by the EU when new market-related regulations like this are adopted, in order to bring them within the scope of their market surveillance framework. However, at this stage, the amendment can have no practical effect within the EU since there are no technical requirements yet for manufacturers to comply with. Those will be put in place over the next couple of years in related EU delegated acts. In addition, in terms of DSC scrutiny, this amendment won't have any practical effect here because the regulation itself, 2025/14, does not apply here since it's not currently covered under the protocol. In terms of impact then, it does not therefore appear that the application of Article 51 of this Replacement EU Act could have a significant impact specific to everyday life for communities in Northern Ireland in a way that is able to persist. Should the EU in the future make a formal request through the Article 13.4 protocol process to have Regulation EU 2025/14 included under the protocol, that request has progressed, it would appear that DSC would have the opportunity at that point to consider the impact of introducing this new type approval framework at that point. Happy to take any questions.
Pretty self-explanatory. Jonathan?
Thank you, Adrian. Obviously, this particular article is part of a potential overall regulation, so therefore the policy intent follows. Could I ask, do the department have a view on the original regulation?
The one that's just been adopted?
No, the overarching regulation in terms of new type approvals.
Well, this is it's a new area, so there hasn't been a previous one.
Yeah. So.
Well, we will be in discussion with DFT on its implication, because obviously it doesn't apply here at the minute, but we will have to take a view on it. It's currently, I suppose the interesting thing about it is the regulation of this type of machinery that might go on the roads is currently devolved, so it's covered under construction and use and lighting regulations, both here and in GB. It's reserved in GB within the jurisdictions there. So it would be a big change if it's, so we will have to discuss it. I mean, we're planning meetings with the industry association bodies, not to see what application this might have.
Yeah, because it's a fair point. Like, look, we would hold considerable concern about the substance of the overall regulation beyond the part that's being notified today. And I note that the earlier EMs actually noted, in particular, the devolved administrations were consulted on the development. They expressed concern about the potential impact of the proposal in terms of possible disruption to trade machinery between GB and NI. It goes on, there's other correspondence. So therefore, I suppose for me, whilst I look at this particular and I think, right, so a brand new type approval system for off-road machinery is mandatory for placing machinery on the market for Northern Ireland, but not for GB, would threaten the supply. So with that in mind, and looking at, this is covering, for example, combine harvesters, diggers, mowers, probably others that I haven't fully been able to dig down on.
Oh, absolutely.
And when I look at that, and knowing in some instances the significance of the agriculture contracting community here, knowing the construction sector, a lot of their sourcing of those is through GB channels. Is there any assessment from the department about the level of trade GBNI in regards to those specific industries?
Not too much at the minute. We're going to have a chat with the association to see what they think. Obviously, it will change the foundation of how those types of machineries may be approved, because at the minute, obviously, it's construction and use. The onus is on the manufacturer, if you like, to comply with construction and use lighting. If that changes, then they'll have to comply with type approval regulations. The reason why we can't really do too much analysis at the minute is because we don't know what those regulations will look like yet in terms of the technical aspects. But there is potential for divergence and supply chain disruption.
We note that the UK have not notified the EU have not notified the UK that they intend to add the substantive parts of the regulation to the Windsor framework. But in the event that did happen, and therefore this subsequent article, which is in relation to market surveillance, was in place, what practical impact would that have on consumers and businesses in Northern Ireland accessing machinery from GB?
Well, in terms of the market surveillance in the UK is carried out by the DVSA. So they come over, and DVA basically facilitate them in their operations. But it would change the foundation for how they're potentially procured, because obviously it may possibly restrict availability, because you can only buy them then if they're type approved.
So that's just to specify that if the regulation for the new type approval was in place, that under market surveillance, any piece of machinery under the framework that was entering from GB into Northern Ireland that did not conform with that new type, therefore would not be permitted to be on sale in Northern Ireland.
Potentially. Up to now, I think the committee is aware DFT have been very keen to mirror EU regulations in their new type approval schemes that they have in place. So I would have thought that in that event we would be trying, and they would be trying to reduce, if not avoid any divergence. But again, it's hard to say until we know the detail of what's going to be required.
Thank you, Adrian, for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, everybody content? Adrian, sorry, David.
Thanks very much, Chair. Could I just ask, in terms of this coming in, I understand that you haven't at this stage been able to take a detailed analysis in a formal way, but are you aware of any concerns from businesses, manufacturers and so on about the implications for them?
I'm not yet. As I say, we're in the process, or DFT are in the process, and they're including us in setting up meetings with the bodies to find that out. I mean, I do know that from the EU's impact analysis stuff, they seem to be saying that the industry would welcome this, because it would, mean that there'd be standardised manufacturing requirements, as opposed to a bit meal. Every member country has their own.
They, of course, though, wouldn't have the sort of the problems with having to meet two different systems. So it's probably more specific to Northern Ireland.
Well, that's, yes. So yes, I read that with interest, but not.
Yeah. So different, understandable, but it's a different situation for them, I guess. But no, thank you very much for your answer.
Okay, Adrian, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so members, we have heard legal advice, and we've now heard departmental advice on the impact or their other. So under paragraph 8.1 of the Schedule 6B of the 1998 Act, Committee must decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published Replacement EU Act that has been notified. Should the committee fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So, having had regard to the legal advice on whether it appears likely that the Replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments that it amends or replaces, and the departmental assessment on whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist, can I ask, do members wish to hold an inquiry into the Replacement EU Act, Article 51 of the Regulation EU 2025/14 on non-road mobile machinery? David.
Chair, I would propose that we do have an inquiry. Having heard the departmental evidence there, I find it difficult to decouple this regulation from the overarching issue that within the context within which it sits, and therefore I think I've heard enough from the departmental official there to give me concern.
Okay. So you're proposing that we have an inquiry?
Yes.
Okay. We just take a vote. So
do you need a seconder for that?
No.
No. Okay.
Can I ask then, just in terms of the proposal to have an inquiry, those in favour show their hands, please. Okay.
So, against.
Those against?
Okay, so the as proposed by David Brooks, an inquiry into Regulation EU 2025/14. Ayes, we have David Brooks, Jonathan Buckley, Steve Aiken. Noes, we have Philip McGuigan, Declan Kearney, Emma Sheeran, Owen Tennyson and Kate Nicholl. So the proposal falls.
Okay. So can I just, I had said at the start of the meeting that I have to give evidence at the Communities Committee at 12:15. They're actually moving quicker. So I'm actually going at 11:15. So can I just have an agreement that I do Chair's business now before handing over to David, if people are okay with that?
Okay.
So Chair's business was supposed to be items 12, so it's just to inform everybody that there's a note in the meeting that myself and David had with the Minister and Permanent Secretary for the Department of Economy, which was held on the 7th of January, and we talked about it last week. It's in pages 6, 9, 7 of the pack. Are members content to note? Okay, thank you. So with that then, I'm just going to hand over to David to probably conduct the rest of the meeting.
All the best.
Thank you.
A welcome relief, says you.
So I become the entire G as opposed to the entire K.
No problem. So folks, moving then to item 8, and that's the regulation of EU 2024-3115 regarding plant health controls and reporting obligations. And we're going to move to departmental evidence. Thank you for joining us. Just to inform again, members, that this will be recorded by Hansard and refer you to pages 479 to 530 of the meeting pack. I'll remind members that at last week's meeting, the committee received oral evidence from DAERA officials and received an updated EM from the British Government. Following the committee's decision to hold an inquiry, a letter was issued to the British Government requesting views on the EU Act and its impact on communities here, details of the position in England, Scotland and Wales, and any response above and beyond what is included in the EM is due on the 20th. Is due by the 20th of January. So yes, just to welcome again John Joe Boyle, Chief Executive of the Forest Service with DAERA, and Charmaine Beer, Head of Plant Division in the Department of Agriculture in DAERA as well. And I'll now ask the officials to brief the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you for the invitation to provide further information for your inquiry on Regulation EU 2024-3115 on plant health. This is of the European Parliament and Council of 27th of November 2024, amending Regulation EU 2016-2031 as regards multi-annual survey programmes, notifications concerning the presence of regulated non-quarantine pests, temporary derogations from import prohibitions and special import requirements, and establishment of procedures for granting them, temporary import requirements for high-risk plants, plant products and other objects, the establishment of procedures for the listing of high-risk plants, the contents of phytosanitary certificates and the use of plant passports, and as regards certain reporting requirements for demarcated areas and surveys of pests, and amending Regulation EU 2017-625 as regards certain notifications of non-compliance. As we stated last week, this regulation is amending legislation that sits under Annex 2 of the Windsor Framework. This is currently under the Secretary of State's control. The changes are to enhance effectiveness, transparency and practical implementation of the EU plant health regulatory system, but do not change overall plant health policy. It does not change the Windsor Framework Agreement for the movement of plants and plant products into Northern Ireland. Officials in DEFRA and DAERA have assessed that the regulation does not significantly differ in whole or part from the content of scope of the EU instrument which it amends or replaces, and would not have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities in Northern Ireland in a way that is liable to persist. This regulation will apply to all EU member states and also to Northern Ireland as a result of the Windsor Framework Agreement. It amends EU 2016-2031, known as the EU Plant Health Regulation, on specific reporting requirements and procedures for implementing controls in respect of certain high-risk plants. It also amends Regulation EU 2017-625, the official controls regulations regarding specific notifications of non-compliance. Following on from the evidence that we presented last week, we requested if there were specific questions that the committee wished us to respond to, and the committee forwarded 8 questions, which I will now address. The first 2 questions regard GB to NI trade movement. What is the volume of trade in plants moving from GB to NI? How much of this trade concerns plants moving with a Northern Ireland plant health label, and how much has to comply with red lane procedures? In answer to this, during the calendar year of 2024, a total of 10,763 consignments of plants were received at ports in Northern Ireland. This equates to an average of just over 200 consignments per week. Of this, there were 1,708 consignments of plant products moved into Northern Ireland for use in the Northern Ireland market under the Northern Ireland Plant Health Label Scheme, NIFL, otherwise known as Green Lane Procedure. The total number of consignments entering Northern Ireland using the Red Lane Procedure was 9,055. This can be further broken down to 7,536 consignments from GB under full official controls regulation compliance, 236 consignments from rest of world, and 1,283 consignments destined for ROI which were transiting through Northern Ireland. It is important to note that many Northern Ireland businesses choose to bring consignments to Northern Ireland with phytosanitary certificates under OCR checks. This enables them to subsequently supply market opportunities for part or whole consignments to the EU, particularly Republic of Ireland, at a later date. Moving to the third question, if the legislation wasn't to apply and as a result we were out of sync with the digital systems that are being set up under the legislation, what impact would that have on traders and businesses here? The introduction of ePhyto digital system eliminates the need for a competent authority in GB to provide a scanned copy of the original phytosanitary certificate to accompany the consignment to a Northern Ireland point of entry, which reduces burden on business. Enabled by these amendments, the GB consignor can send the ePhyto reference number and date of issue to the Northern Ireland consignee, which can be used by DERA as the competent authority. The operator responsible for the consignment can use the ePhyto as part of the pre-notification procedure, which can be available within an hour of confirmation of a satisfactory inspection of the consignment in GB. This negates time delays currently experienced for issue of hard copy phytosanitary certificates from the competent authority in GB prior to dispatch. Feedback from ePhyto testers, including some Northern Ireland businesses, is that this represents a welcome improvement, in particular minimising timeframes for movements of goods. Additionally, there are significant benefits to DERA as the competent authority to streamline digital reporting. Improving swifter reporting and dissemination of information on plant health increases the capacity and speed to act to reduce risk to plant health security for our agriculture, forestry and horticulture businesses, which is beneficial. The fourth and fifth questions, can you give us an update on the UK government's position on regulated non-quarantine pests, RNQPs? The explanatory memorandum produced when the Act was at a proposal stage stated that this policy area was under review. Do you expect the government to introduce similar requirements for RNQPs for plants entering the GB market? We have no further update to provide on this other than what is stated in the EM provided to you that indicated that RNQP is still under review by the UK government. The sixth and seventh questions both relate to Plant Health Common Framework matters. To what extent do existing requirements relating to the import of plants and plant products vary across the UK? What impact would the regulation have on the operation of the Common Framework and on regulatory divergence within the UK? The Common Framework recognises the scope of divergence across UK nations in line with devolved administrations' respective legislative requirements. This regulation has no impact on the operation of the Common Framework and doesn't change the extent of any regulatory divergence. It makes technical and procedural amendments to the existing regulations. The final question received from the committee, can you tell us about your discussions with DEFRA on the regulation? The plant health team in DERA have had recent discussions with plant health policy counterparts in DEFRA to discuss the impact of this EU regulation in GB and NI. As you're aware, DEFRA provided an explanatory memorandum on this regulation describing the anticipated implications for the UK. Their development of the EM included discussions with DERA, plant health officials. The impact assessment you received last week was drafted by DEFRA and DERA. Both agree the low impact of the regulation, concluding this was not introducing any plant health policy changes, but improved procedural aspects of implementing the existing plant health regulation, EU 2016-2031. Shared common benefits were noted in the digitisation of returns from competent authorities, the use of ePhytos, the change to import prohibitions and derogations, the removal of some NI reporting requirements, and the reduction in frequency of others. I trust this information is useful for your inquiry, and we're happy to take any further questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much. I felt that was very useful, and particularly the way in which the questions from the previous session were answered like that, personally. I think that's the first time I've seen that done from witnesses, so thank you for it. If possible, if that was the case again and that was prepared in advance, would it be possible for the committee to be given that briefing? Because I haven't got it in my pack, I don't think. No. it'd be interesting, because some of the figures that you quote would be very interesting for follow-up questions, if possible. So you maybe supply that. Just a couple of extra questions to it from myself. In relation to the level of trade, do you have any stats or statistics, you might not have it offhand, but if you can, that relate to business to consumer in relation to plant movements from GB to Northern Ireland, and the level that was at pre-withdrawal agreement protocol or Windsor framework and post for interest? And the other question in relation to that would be the number of high-risk plants that existed pre withdrawal agreement protocol or framework and post, just for comparison. That's about it from me. Thank you. I don't expect you to have those offhand,
Okay, yeah.
but it can be supplied.
So your second point, high risk plants before and after?
Yeah,
Okay.
From GB.
We'll have to come back to you with some of those details. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Is there any further questions? No, thank you. And as colleague said there, thank you for the nature of your presentation as well. It was much appreciated, and a lot of the questions that may otherwise have been asked have been dealt with comprehensively. So thank you very much. And I'll let you get on with your day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you.
Yes.
David, to pick up on the a point there about Charmaine's response to the questions, if the Secretariat and the committee clerk could perhaps give consideration to this. There is a template there which I think we would benefit from, where we in fact to get other witnesses from departments to adopt in future sessions.
No, I would agree with that.
So if there was some way of perhaps developing a proposal there, Marie.
Yes, I think.
And then commending that to future witnesses that would attend.
For most of the briefing papers you receive attached to the back, we would put the suggested questions. So the approach that was taken this time was that the officials were provided with those questions, and then they were able to answer them coherently.
Can I ask, Marie, was that the first time that has been done in terms of supplying them with questions, suggested lines of questions? It's not all.
That was the first time, simply because it was a follow-on from last week. Normally it's yourselves who get the questions, but it's clearly been demonstrated that it's very worthwhile.
I'd agree with Declan on this point. I think that was extremely helpful, with the caveat, if they are prepared in advance, and I would imagine in many cases they are, but not all, if they were provided to us, because I know some of the figures I still have lost from our session already, so it would be good for us to have that. Because then that might help inform us for follow-up questions, but also maybe prevent us from asking some questions that they've already dealt with.
I think it's more a case of yourselves going away and reflecting on that, Marie. And I'm not suggesting that we can come up with a template that is one size fitting all, but certainly that was a very beneficial presentation. And if we were getting more of that, it would add to the coherence of the committee scrutiny.
Yeah. Well, if members are content that the questions that we would normally put in the briefing paper, we will send to the relevant officials, ask them if they can provide a written briefing answering those questions, and we can take it from there as we go along if any other changes need to be made.
We shouldn't tie our hands. I mean, we shouldn't make this into some kind of a rigid approach.
That's right.
Yeah.
But if there's a way of adapting this and making use of it in the future, it would be helpful.
Certainly, no problem.
Thank you. Thanks, Declan. Moving on then, just to inform members that the committee's citizen space survey has launched and will close on the 19th of January. The committee will consider both the citizen space survey responses and a draft report at the meeting on the 23rd of January. The committee will also agree its final report at that meeting as well. Moving on then to our next item of business, which is regulation EU 2024-3110. Laying down harmonised rules for the marketing of construction products, and again we will be moving to departmental evidence, and again this will be recorded by Hansard, and refer members also to pages 531 to 692 of the meeting pack, and remind members that at last week's meeting and following the committee's decision to hold an inquiry, a letter issued to the British Government seeking views on the impact of the Replacement EU Act and to ascertain the position in England, Scotland and Wales with a response date of 20th of January 2025. In response, an updated EM was received this morning and has been circulated in hard copy. A further letter issued to the British Government requesting a response to the questions that were included as part of last week's and this week's briefing paper. The questions can be found at page 536 of the meeting pack. Our response was received this morning and again has been circulated. And the members can see their additional sheet. We just want to welcome David Porter, the Director of Engineering for DFI, Stephen Bradshaw, the Deputy Director of Procurement and Commercial for DFI, John Burke, Deputy Director of Properties Division of the Department of Finance, and Shane Doris, the Director of Environmental Resources and Policy Division for DERA. And I'll now thank the officials for attending and ask them to brief committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee, for the opportunity to come and talk to you. As was said, I'm David Porter, and in my day job, I'm the Director of Engineering within the Department for Infrastructure, and that makes me the Chief Highway Engineer for Northern Ireland. But I've also been asked to deliver the opening statement today on behalf of all the departments, and we're represented here by a number of them, but this is an opening statement which sets out just the position across the various departments and the position that we find ourselves in, and we're trying to give you some insight into the impacts that these the construction product regulations will have, but I will go into it that in some areas it is limited in terms of the information that we hold within the department. And I want to, at the outset, reassure the committee that the hesitancy isn't because we don't want to share the information, it's genuinely because we don't have it. So we will tell you what we have and explain what we have. And if you hear us saying we just don't know, genuinely it's because we just don't know, and it's not because we're playing clever with the department or with the committee. That is genuinely the position. So in terms of the opening statement that I've been asked to deliver, so as you know, this is a reserve matter led by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And enforcement is a role that falls to councils here or the MHCLG, which is the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Secretary of State, supported by the Office of Product Safety and Standards. The Northern Ireland departments are largely consumers of products subject to these regulations, and each department will have to assess how the revisions may impact on their operations, and it will vary from department. Because I'm from DFI, I'm going to give you an example of how I think this will impact in terms of DFI, because I think that's useful to understand how the department consumes these products and why some of the things I said in the opening in terms of why we can't give information in terms of the wider impact is very difficult. So if you think of DFI, we purchase through contract construction projects. Now we don't buy the individual products, so we buy the A5 or we buy the A6 or we buy a wastewater treatment works, and then the contractor or the subcontractor supply the materials. So that's the first scenario, and that would not be unusual for scenario for other government departments, that they contract out something. They want to build a hospital, they want to build a school, they want to build a road, they want to build a water treatment works, and they contract out something, and by virtue of that the department is availing of construction products, but not directly. It's through a contract. Because DFI has a direct labour, occasionally we will buy products ourselves. So the direct labour are the industrial operatives that carry out road maintenance and also watercourse maintenance. And in order to carry out their function, they need certain materials. So in some cases, we buy materials directly. So cement, as an example, we will buy that indirectly. We will stock that in our stores. And if a manhole needs reset or a gully needs reset, we will use that material. And therefore, we could get embroiled in the construction regulations. The third way that we deal with these is, in some circumstances, departments specify construction materials, or it's embroiled in some of the way that we write our policy, that it points you towards the use of a certain construction product. So the example, if you can think of, or that I can think of, is private streets. So if a developer builds a private street and doesn't want to maintain that, they enter into an agreement, a private streets agreement, and if that road is built to the appropriate standard, at some point the department will approve that or will adopt that. In order to demonstrate that that is the correct standard, the department sets the standard. It sets a technical standard for that. So whilst we don't have our hands on the construction product regulations, by virtue of us setting the technical standards, we have an interest in that. We are in that space where we will be specifying the use of particular blacktop mixes, or the specification for a gully, or the size or the nature or the construction material used to form a pipe, are part and parcel of what we do. So that's where a government department could be specifying something in construction, could look as though they have responsibility, but that's separate from the construction product regulation. It doesn't then mean that because we have specified a particular asphalt mix, and that includes construction materials, that therefore then the responsibility for enforcing or for dealing with the construction product regulations then transfers to the department. It's a reserved matter, sits in the ministry, as I've described, and the enforcement then locally would be through the council. So no government department has the expertise, resources or data to assess the impact on wider society. So we can make comment about how it would impact on our own departments, typically in those three areas where we're buying by contract, buying directly or specifying. So we can make comment on that, but we don't have information in terms of the impact on the wider society.
May I interject, David? Sir, David, thanks very much. Just a quick one. So if I'm reading this correctly, because if you'll be specifying the technical specifications for something that's likely to be done, so basically it'll have to be done so that it complies with this rule and regulation, so it has to be within the CE regulation. So regardless of whatever happens to be, the contractor is going to have to use the CE stuff. Correct. Because otherwise you would not be in compliance with the rules and regulations.
Correct. Yes. Okay. Correct. And in the scenario where we are checking that, we will be saying, have they got a CE certificate? Yes, that's compliant. Have they laid that material properly? Yes. Is it to the agreed layout? Yes, that road's suitable for adoption. In the event that they use a material that is not CE marked, we deal with that through the contract or through the private streets determination, where we would be saying you can't demonstrate that these materials meet the specification, therefore we're not adopting, and therefore you need to reach an agreement to either remove that material or we will find a different way of getting it approved. And in the scenario where they use a material where there's a questionable CE marking, that would then be a matter that we would refer to the council for enforcement.
So just for an example, just to get my head around this and the rest of it, so let's say A5, construction part of the A5, because this is likely to come within 24 months, all the construction materials you're going to have to use for building the A5 all have to be CE marked. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we talked about the impact on the department and how the departments don't have the impact on the wider society. However, we've tried to give the information as best we could in terms of the impact of the new regulations on our department and on the impacts it may well have, or to give you an indication of the impacts that they may well have on the wider society. The assessment is difficult as any impact will be dependent on how the UK government chooses to develop the regulations for GB, and therefore we're relying on the UK's government's explanatory memorandum, which has just been published in the last 36 hours, and it in essence says that there's no significant impact on trade envisaged or expected. We have been working with MHC LG, and particularly DOF has been had some limited engagement in the latter part of last calendar year about these regulations, although that has been fairly light touch and crucially did not address plans for the development of the GB regulations. And it was only in the middle of December that departments became aware that new regulations would be published over the Christmas holiday period. Recognising that this timeline would cause difficulties, our department have worked together to provide the committee with as much information in advance of your meeting last week as was possible. And it was a tricky situation in that at that stage the explanatory memorandum hadn't been published. There was a draft of it, we were aware of the draft, but it hadn't at that stage been published. So it was a difficult situation in that that document hadn't actually been made public. So we did encourage our DOF colleagues, certainly encouraged MHCLG to publish the explanatory memorandum at the earliest possible opportunity. And we also set out the difficulties that late or non-publication would cause. And I have to say this was taken on board, and the explanatory memorandum has now been published. And it says that the UK government does not anticipate that the revised regulations will result in significant impacts for those selling construction materials between Northern Ireland and GB.
And so just sort of looking at sort of paragraph 25 of the financial implications of the explanatory note, it says details of it's classic civil service ease. It says details of the likely potential costs are uncertain at this time. Then it comes around and says, but we do not anticipate any significant Northern Ireland specific financial implications, even though it doesn't know what the potential costs are. Yeah. They're mutually contradictory statements. It's classic Sir Humphrey speak.
Yeah. Well,
but if we look at, I think, paragraph 14, and where it talks about sort of impact of the regulations on Northern Ireland, and then it lists there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particular points. I think you don't have to be a member of the Construction Employers Federation to notice that each one of those has been a significant cost. Yeah. So I'm sort of confused. I can't really make head nor tail of this EM. You can't say one thing and then do another.
I think my understanding, and maybe others will come in, is that they're not saying that the regulations will not have there is a burden and a financial burden to the regulation. It's not. There's no differentiation between what the cost of that will occur in Northern Ireland and the cost in others. And you can see, and I'll go through the 5 points as you say. If you have to provide more information on a product, that doesn't come for free. There will be a cost of that. Yeah. And provided that cost is reasonable and it allows better informed decisions, well then that was a reasonable cost. So the costs associated with actually introducing the regulations, there will be costs associated with it. There just won't be a differentiation between Northern Ireland and GB.
If we can just hold any other questions to the end, so we can make progress on the presentation. Thank you.
So it might be helpful if I draw a couple of points out of the memorandum, and I'll jump forward to the differences. So it provides more clarity on the development of standards through the inclusion of a 3-year plan. It brings reuse and recycled products within the scope of the regulations. It expands the scope of the regulations to bring online marketplaces and fulfilment service providers into scope. It introduces new requirements for placing construction products on the market, such as a requirement to provide information on the product's environmental suitability. And again, that's an example where that doesn't come from free. There's going to have to be some testing to that in order to be able to demonstrate that. It just can't be a statement to say this will cause no harm. You have to be able to demonstrate that. So that's where there is a cost to these. It's just not differential. It also then seeks to enable better information sharing between bodies that are responsible for ensuring conformity within the regulations. There's improvements to market surveillance and enforcement. And there's also the establishment of a construction products database, which integrates with the digital product passport envisaged by the ASPR regulations, which will become mandatory in 2027. We understand that the UK government consider that these new regulations will introduce the following new requirements in Northern Ireland. It will require manufacturers to maximise the use of recycled materials. It will require details on the environmental sustainability of a product to be provided and on its packaging. It will require products to be designed so that they can be used for as long as possible, So by making information available on the repair and the availability of spare parts for 10 years after placing the product on the market. And it will require digital labelling through the digital product passport, and it will provide information about the installation and de-installation of a product. I'll just then go, I'm conscious of your time, Chair, so I'll just then maybe go to a couple of closing remarks then. As I said, colleagues are in attendance from other departments and may well be able to answer some of your specific questions and how they impact on some other departments. However, I reiterate that this is a reserved matter, and any impact on the supply or the availability of goods will be highly dependent on what the UK government chooses to do with the equivalent regulations for GB. And the regulations across Northern Ireland, GB and EU are currently largely in sync, and I understand that the GB regulations will be reviewed over the course of this year. The explanatory memorandum suggests a direction of travel for the GB regulations that is closer to the EU regulations, but those decisions will be taken in London after this committee and the Assembly have had to take their decision. So we do thank you for the opportunity. I hope those opening remarks are helpful. And as I say, we're happy to answer the questions as best as we can. And again, to emphasise, it's not because if we don't know, we'll just have to say we don't know. And it's not that we're trying to be evasive. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. And the committee is used to the fact that some of this information sits in London, but we are thankful for our own departments coming, because we do think that largely you are the relationship sort of gatekeepers with some of our key stakeholders in some of these issues. Just a couple of questions before I open up to the others. UKG, in talking about the scale of trade, said that a high level figure is unlikely to provide conclusive insights into the impact the regulation will have. Says this is because construction trade is not reflective of the extent to which the regulation may benefit or impact individual businesses, which it says cannot be modelled uniformly, especially given exemptions for small businesses that are contained within the regulation, and which committee has noted. They would also note that this information is not held by Cabinet Office, and relevant bodies would need to be engaged to see if any modelling has been undertaken. In view of that, can I ask, have any departments undertaken such modelling, and how the trade in construction products sort of GB to DNI will be impacted by the regulation?
If I certainly hasn't carried out any such modelling.
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
No. We reserve. It's back to this issue that it's principally a reserved matter. I'm just where did that statement come from?
That's within the EM.
Right.
Sorry, if I can just correct, Chair, it was a response that the committee received to correspondence it issued last week to Cabinet Office.
Well, that's the letter. Are you aware of any public body that's carrying out that modelling?
No.
No. Thank you very much. I'll come back to an action maybe for the committee then thereafter. They've also said on point covering micro enterprises in Northern Ireland that whilst the government welcomes the regulation, taking into account the unique needs of small businesses, this is not data which we would provide, and for the same reasons above, instead we would encourage the committee to engage with the relevant public authorities. How many do you have any information in terms of how many Northern Ireland businesses would fall into the micro enterprise category set out in the regulation? Do you consider that these simplified procedures would be effective in reducing the burden and costs and regulation on SMEs and micro enterprises?
No, we've no answer to that. We've done no assessment of that.
Okay, thanks very much. And again, then we'll probably have an action on that, but I'll come back to that. Is there any questions from the committee? John?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much. I understand it's a very difficult one to quantify, particularly as there's so many moving parts, namely why there's so many departments before us. Suppose probably just to specify why it's such an interest for the committee to know the levels of trade, because the EU impact assessment in its original form reckoned that an 8% cost increase would be for affected businesses. So that was their words. So therefore the committee set down a trail of trying to ascertain those levels. It's difficult in the UK explanatory memorandum and indeed subsequent letters that we've received to ascertain still what those levels of trade are, because they determined it would not have any bearing. But that's all based upon the premise that the UK government follow a similar procedure, and I know that's the place that you guys are in. And it's, when I look at it and it says, so in a letter we received from Paul Flynn on the 16th of January in relation to this, it said that I would also highlight the government's conclusion in the explanatory memorandum that the revised CPR combined with planning domestic reforms is not likely to result in significant impacts in the terms mentioned. That's if they do.
Yeah.
What is the consequences if they don't for the scale of trade in terms of the increase in costs for your particular departments? Is there any way to quantify that?
So, again, no, at this minute in time. However, I did think about this in terms of answering it, not in terms of the local economy or the smaller SMEs, but in terms of the department. Tried to think of an example which would be a useful example for you to understand or to get an insight into what the potential problem would be. And the material that I've come up with is bituminous materials. So there is no facility to make that in Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So 100% of bitmac materials or bituminous materials, the raw material is imported. And we've recently carried out an exercise, not for this.
Imported from where?
Yeah, good. Super question, and I'm going to get. So we've recently carried out an exercise not because of this, but because of a separate contractual issue that we were dealing with. So under our contracts, we pay an indice. So because our contract lasts for so long, you can't turn around to a contractor and say, give me a price on day one, and in 4 years' time, that's going to be the same price. So there's an index length element in that the department knows that as inflation impacts on contracts, we as the client, we pay for that. During the Ukraine war, it was clear that those were getting out of sync. Now, that's not an unusual situation. Sometimes indices do get out of sync, and then they rectify themselves. But it got out of sync, and the gap kept widening. And as a result of that, we had to do a particular piece of work on for bituminous materials to work out, right, what is a reasonable response to that. As a result of that, we had to dig into exactly the question you've asked as to, right, where does this material come from, and what is a good proxy to work out what the index is. So 100% of the material doesn't come from Northern Ireland, it is imported. 100% of it comes from Europe.
Okay.
We also widened out that exercise to the GB market because we engaged with the Mineral Products Association here, and they wanted to engage with their colleagues, the Mineral Products Association in GB, to see, are you experiencing the same thing? And they carried out the same exercise, and 70% of the bituminous material in GB also comes from Europe.
Okay.
So that's I think
if you were to follow that to its natural conclusion,
depending on what the UK government decided.
Yeah, that's the point.
Absolutely right.
So I suppose probably we have vague sort of flirtation with the fact that may be the case. So the UK government will consider the relevant merits of the EU revised CPR as part of developing its proposals for reform as set out above, but no guarantees. So my point would be that in the event that it did not happen, and the EU assessed that it's an 8% cost increase for affected businesses, those affected businesses are Northern Ireland businesses in the context that I've described. Yes, you following?
Yeah.
Given the complex picture that you described in your own particular department, so a pie split up of contract versus direct purchase of construction products and a specification of type of construction. How does that pie split down, and which one of those sectors are most impacted by something like this, if that's answerable now? I know it's quite complex, but...
Yeah. Well, in in money terms, certainly the big spender will be the contract works by far and away, but it'll have the same percent, I suspect, assuming that the 8% is right, and depending on what the UK government does, it would have the same relative impact in percentage terms to each of those sectors, because they're all equally reliant on materials.
That's for one particular department. I imagine others are the same. Yeah. So from a finance perspective, from the department, procurement particularly, if there was an 8% increase across the board on affected businesses, if the CPR didn't apply in GB, what would be the cost implications to the Northern Ireland executive in relation to, from a finance procurement perspective?
So I come at it from a slightly different branch, and we would be dealing with some of the policy matters and how, if we were really here to provide a kind of bit of reassurance on a different matter. But it would seem very clear that obviously if there's a restriction on the supply of products, or if all products go up by 8%, or if some do and some don't, but we have to buy the CPR ones, then obviously it's going to have an impact in the same way.
Yeah. Is there an ability, and I don't expect anyone to have it here now, but is there an ability for us to ascertain, particularly from a public sector perspective, finance, procurement, what that potential cost could be if applied right across the board, across the different departments? Is that
I would have to take that back. You might take a very rough rule of thumb, which is totally inappropriate, quite possibly. My quantity surveyor colleagues might go sort of nuts, but if you were to say that half of building work is labour and half is materials, and you've increased the price of materials by 8%, is that perhaps a 4%? Now, I don't know if I've got those ratios right. If they're 2/3 labour, 1/3 materials, that might be a way that one would look at it. But there will be some regime occurring in any case in GB. So it's back to this issue about, is it the difference or is it the relative difference? And then the other question just to ask about the 8%, which is a figure I hadn't seen or wasn't aware of. I'm sure it's there, but I hadn't seen it. Is that the combined effect of the construction products regulation, or is it the change which is a regime which already exists, by the way? So all of these issues and the potential risk of divergence because the EU adopts a new standard or new way of doing things, or because GB decides to do a new way of doing things. All those risks are already kind of there under the current regime. Do these changes that come through increase that or change that? Possibly, but that's a lot of the construction products regulations that have just been made, the revised ones, are essentially very, very similar to the regime that's already there. But there are these list of new requirements that you noted on the EM, of course.
Yeah, and again, I can only read what the EU impact assessment said, so it didn't specify that particular point, so it would be interesting to know.
It'd be worth actually drawing that out with the UK government, just which of that 8% is sort of baseline as a result of the change in the regulations more generally, and which of it is specifically if there was divergence.
Well, would it be possible for, not expecting today, but for the relevant departments, or indeed centralised, what potentially 8% would mean to the public sector? I know this isn't just about the public sector, but I'm looking at your own particular departments just while you're in front. Would that be possible to try to ascertain?
It'd be something that we could take away.
Okay.
I think it would be useful if we could see.
It's in the original EU impact assessment, and I'm sure the clerk could provide that.
Have a look at that.
It is. And the final question from me would be, in relation to the conversations with UKG about where they are, again, suppose probably vague flirtations with it looks good, that's where we're aiming for. Is anybody in any position to give an update as to how far advanced the conversations are with UKG about the potential for following the CPR?
Other than what we've said, that we've engaged with UK government to understand that what's in the memorandum and then it'll be for whatever UK government decide then.
But has there been any specific engagement with any of your individual departments in relation to this with UKG post the...
Not on that specific matter, because it is a reserve matter for them to kind of lead.
It is a reserve matter, but it does say that the policy intent does cross over to the Northern Ireland Executive, and therefore there is engagement. That we're told that right throughout different explanatory memorandums as we get them. They change significantly over time, believe it or not. But the principle's still there, that where there's an overlap with devolved institutions, that there is continual conversations about the impacts.
So there has been engagement, and more recently, even as early or as late as yesterday, we had further engagement with them just in terms of the content of the EM. But in terms of that specific question about the subsequent, I'm not aware that we've had that discussion.
So most latest conversations with your individual departments with UKG on this is essentially what's contained within the EM. No further updates in relation to where they are in their process of deciding whether or not they're going to use their planned domestic reforms for planning to incorporate that.
That's correct. The most recent conversations have been about that document in the EM.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Johnny. Owen?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that evidence so far, David and team. Just in relation to paragraph 20 in the updated EM, the government makes reference that manufacturers moving goods from Great Britain are likely to meet these new requirements in order to continue also supplying the EU market. Do we have any indication, and I suspect the answer is no, but do we have any indication what the proportion of those businesses selling the products affected by this regulation are that are supplying both the EU market and the domestic GB market at the moment?
I certainly don't have that. I'm not sure that that even came up in any of the conversations that we've had. So no, we wouldn't have that.
Okay, no, that's no problem at all. The only other question that I had is, we've talked about the potential impact of the regulation should it apply, but do you have any assessment in terms of the impact on businesses here in Northern Ireland, or indeed the public sector, what the impact might be should the regulation not be applied?
And it would depend on what scenario you then run and what is put in its place. So all we can do is go by what it says in the EM, which is it looks like that's not going to be the scenario, and therefore no impact is envisaged, or no significant change, and certainly no differential change.
Okay. Is there not the issue that if it weren't applied here, the existing CPR regime would continue here? So you would end up with 3 different regimes, heaven forfend. So you would have the new regime and for the EU, you would have the old EU regime operating here, and you would have the GB regime.
GB version, yeah. But again, what the EM saying, that's unlikely, and there's unlikely to be different. So we're taking that at face value, but I understand this committee's purpose is to scrutinise that and to reassure yourselves that is actually the case.
Thank you.
Just to overlap on Owen's point, because I think it is an interesting one. The old CPR regulation that exists in GB, it was carried over post exit. So, on that case of potential divergence, that would only occur if GB moved away from what is currently in existence. I'm right on that.
We'd have to take a conscious decision.
I think in terms of the broad technical standard, that might be correct. But the regime that's the regulations that were introduced in GB were changed after Brexit, because part of the regulation says about affixing a CE mark, and they're not authorised to do that any longer. So you would have to really look carefully at that change. Is that the only change, like a branding, the stamp? Is that all that changed? Okay. So there is some small, but nonetheless potentially significant change there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Steve?
No, just David, it's sort of a techie engineering question. Something that's come up with the Finance Committee, because we've always been worried about what's been going on with the Grenville inquiry and the changes in building materials. I noticed you're talking about the use of recycled materials. One of the real questions that was coming out of Grenville was how sort of materials are being used, recycled, put into position as well, and their sort of fire safety regulations. What happens if the GB regulations are, because of Grenfell, are at a higher level than the CE regulations and marks. Does that mean that we would potentially be putting lesser specification materials into our construction materials because they were under the CE regulations rather than the GB regulations that obviously would, because of Grenfell and some of these things, and I'm particularly talking about sort of the fire retardant materials and some of the other construction materials?
I could speak to that, I think, a little. So there's lots of strands to that, but essentially the vast bulk, and certainly under the existing CPR regime, one of the changes you might know or notice, if you look at the old CPR and the new CPR, it goes from 39 pages to 106. So there's lots of, and I don't know if it's just words for words or how that all accumulates or where that all goes. But essentially, under the current CPR regime, you have a declaration of performance.
Yeah.
So the idea then is that you have a harmonised technical standard of assessment. So it's really setting out, these are the metrics.
Yeah.
A very straightforward example might be that you have to describe all your pipework in centimetres, not in inches, or so that there's a common technical way of doing the assessment. So if you're doing a fire test, you're doing a fire test that tests the way it combusts as opposed to the way a flame spreads over it or something, right? So they set that out so that there's a common technical language. The old regulations don't say what that minimum performance is. That would generally have been left to building regulations and building codes, and that's where the devolved administrations then usually follow the developments in the UK or in England and bring that standard up to play with where it has got to in England. So really what you were talking about was a common framework as opposed to a performance standard.
Yeah.
There does seem to be something of a spirit of a certain degree of moving that on a little bit in the revised regulations, where the EU is sort of saying, nonetheless, this should be the minimum standard. You know, that technical assessment bodies and groups and the standards institutes that look at these harmonised ways of doing assessments could also say what a minimum product conformity standard might be. So it's quite complex, and I'm not quite sure how it gets developed. But if that were to happen, I would have thought that it would be very unlikely that the UK wouldn't either be ahead of or on the game or trying to keep that consistent.
I think, sorry, with indulgence to the chair, sort of when I was the chair of the Finance Committee, that was the one thing that made me very nervous, is when we were dealing with sort of Grenfell, and particularly a particular company that decided to come and tell us that because it met CE standards, or European standards, it exceeded the GB standards, and subsequent to a very public inquiry and sort of horrific incident, it's very clearly that they didn't. Yeah. Or they deliberately manipulated the rules and the tests, that whatever that happens to be. I mean, a concern that we'll be having as MLAs is that if this comes through, are we opening ourselves up to accepting lower standards than the rest of our nation because of this? Or are these standards going to be the same, and particularly when it comes to safety regulations? Because that's the thing that's making me quite nervous.
Well, I should say that the vast majority of those, particularly where they're significant, really ought to be addressed. So we aren't able to govern putting products on the market as a reserved matter, but the products that you install are a matter for building regulations.
Yeah.
So you do have control on that.
Thank you. Is there no further indication? No. Then it just remains me to thank you very much for your attendance and for your briefing, and let you get on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just while officials are leaving their members, just draw back set a couple of actions, go out of my own questions. Members content that we write to NISRA and relevant industry bodies, including the list of stakeholders, to request information on the scale of construction of trade, GB, DNI, and whether they've carried out any analysis on the impact of the regulation.
Sure, just to say, I am content with that, but I think it's important that we bear in mind that those high-level figures, as the government did point out in fairness, around construction trade will not be indicative of the level of trade that is affected by this specific regulation. So I just think it's important that we bear that in mind and contextualise that NISRA probably won't be able to give us the level of detail that we need.
If we are able to get the information, we can then analyse in that way.
Happy for the request to go, but I just think it's important that we are. I mean, I've seen it misrepresented in relation to previous regulations where we've had a high level trade figure and the government has been clear actually this regulation doesn't apply to that whole figure, but members of this committee have gone out and presented as though it does. So it's just to put that again on record and put a marker down in respect.
Members of the committee will use different information in different ways, but just if you're happy enough with the request, we will have that discussion and debate, I'm sure, at another time. There's also our members' content that we write to the Department of the Economy to ask how many Northern Ireland businesses would fall into the micro-enterprise, whether it considers the simplified procedures and would be effective in reducing the burden and cost of the updated regulation on SMEs and micro-enterprises. Content. Thank you, members. So just to inform members again that the committee Citizen Space Survey has launched and will close on the 19th of January. And remind members that, as agreed at last week's meeting, the survey was also circulated to relevant stakeholders who responded to the EU consultation on the proposal. The EU consultations took place at roadmap and adoption stages in 2020 and 2022. The consultation responses can be found at pages 668 and 674 of the meeting pack. The committee will consider both the Citizen Space Survey and responses and a draft report at the meeting on the 23rd of January. The committee will also agree its final report at the same meeting. Moving then to the next item of business. It's 2022-677 proposal for a regulation on packaging and packaging waste, and again departmental evidence, and again this will be recorded by Hansard. If I can refer members to the relevant papers at pages 74 and 456 of the meeting pack, and DAERA's assessment of impact on the adopted text is at pages 439 to 443 of the meeting pack. And just then to welcome officials to present to committee. We have Colin Breen, who's Assistant Director of Waste Policy at DAERA, and Janet Sheridan, who's Head of Single-Use Plastics Legislation, again at DAERA. And I would just hand over to you at this point and ask you to brief committee. Thank you.
I was going to say good morning, but we're just about afternoon now. I'm Janet Sheridan, so I'm Head of Single-Use Plastics Legislation. This regulation will actually cover a number of policy areas, but I'm just going to give you a sort of a background and more of a context of it's a directive that's been replaced by regulation. So most goods require packaging at several stages of their product life. Packaging is defined in the current Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive as products made of any materials of any nature to be used for the containment, protection, handling, delivery and presentation of goods, from raw materials to processed goods, from the producer to the user or the consumer. So a wide range of materials are used for packaging. This includes glass, paper, cardboard, metal, plastics, wood, cork, textiles or even ceramics. The directive covered all packaging placed on the EU market and all packaging waste. The rules covered all materials and packaging included industrial, commercial, household and other sectors. The directive aimed to deal with the increasing quantities of packaging waste which caused environmental problems. So the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive was introduced in 1994. The rules regulated what kind of packaging could be placed on the EU market, as well as packaging waste management and packaging waste prevention measures. The provisions were designed to reduce the disposal of packaging waste and promote a more circular economy. So the EU has revised and amended its laws on packaging several times since the introduction of the directive. As part of the European Green Deal and the new Circular Economy Action Plan, the European Commission put forward a revision of the Packaging Waste Directive in November 2022. The directive was considered no longer sufficient in harmonising actions across member states to address wasteful overpackaging, and further measures were required to address the very low uptake of recycled content in plastic packaging. So as the existing rules were in the form of a directive, member states had taken inconsistent approaches on packaging requirements, defining recyclable and reusable packaging and on enforcement. So the introduction of the regulation will have a direct impact on member states, removing inconsistencies and improving legal certainty for business. So while the directive needed transposition by all EU member states into their own legislation and mainly dealt with recycling and waste management, this regulation will be directly applicable in all EU countries, and as a regulation rather than a directive, all member states will be required to fulfil their obligations at the same time and in the same way. So in 2021, each European citizen generated an estimate 190 kilograms of packaging waste, and this showed a 6% increase from the previous year. This figure is expected to grow by nearly 20% by 2030 if no new rules are applied. So the packaging waste regulation is the result of nearly 2 years of discussion and lobbying between EU legislative bodies, industry representatives and environmental NGOs to strike a balance between achieving quick results and setting realistic targets for business. The final text is said to have been watered down from its initial environmental ambition. However, it still maintains a focus on preventing waste from being generated in the first place. With reuse measures, market restriction bans, deposit return scheme obligations, the regulation goes a step further in setting a clear direction for packaging and recycling in the EU. So the packaging waste regulation will govern the design of packaging. It will set reduction in packaging volumes and minimisation of packaging waste. It sets recyclability targets. It will require an increase in the recycled content of packaging and the use of compostable packaging. It will mandate separate collection of packaging waste. It will result in the introduction of new labelling, and it will introduce requirements for deposit return schemes, extended producer responsibility schemes, as well as bans on some single-use plastic items.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Just making sure you're finished there. Thank you. So just before we move into the questions for you, myself, can I ask, you've said that, where is it now? You're unable to assess the impact of, the likely impact of the regulation, but there's significant interest amongst stakeholders. Could I ask, in terms of that interest and what you've been hearing from stakeholders, is there a great deal of concern or any what kind of concerns are being brought forward, and to what extent that you can comment on impact you think it's likely to have? Perhaps you can give some commentary on that.
I'll try to cover some of that. So, I've been speaking to some of industry, and I think the overriding thing is that it's welcomed. The direction of travel is very similar to the direction of travel within the packaging industry, towards more sustainability, more better environmental outcomes. There's definitely some concern around how this will interact with GB regulations. Really, most company, or a lot of the larger companies certainly, are both selling to the GB market, the NI market, and the EU market, and it's problematic where they have to do slightly different things for different markets, which increased cost. That's probably where the main concern point is, but the overarching thing is that it is welcomed in terms of the direction of travel, in terms of the things it's trying to do. An awful lot of this, the packaging back to waste, I know I appreciate it's a very long regulation, but there isn't an awful lot of fine detail as to how the things are going to work. A lot of them are quite far away yet, so there's an awful lot of implementing acts and delegated acts to come to explain the detail. So, in stakeholder conversations, they're at times unsure of exactly what it will mean, but there's definitely a welcoming of the overall ambition, and consumers likewise want to see better environmental outcomes, but obviously some concerns over how this will interact with GB regulations, whether GB will align, and I suppose that's where we are so far.
I think that's the crux as well, in that we often discuss sometimes in this committee that what the thing that's coming forward is going to have a positive impact on something, say the environment. the ambition will always be, you would think, to do something positive and bring it forward, and you won't get any individuals or companies out there arguing against, actively, openly arguing against environmental goals. But I guess it's that impact of how this works in this particular place, and with the different relationships with the EU and with GB, and how that will impact, and the cost implications and so on, that really I think needs to be considered. Could I ask, leading on from that then, what plans are you aware of in terms of the UKG to further align with elements of PPWR in future? And because there is talk of some attempts, I think, to sort of bridge gaps. Can you speak to that at all?
So I'll say a bit, and I know Janet will say a bit too, maybe. But so the UK government have sort of tentatively said that they plan to consult on alignment across these areas, and I know that held back on the extended producer responsibility labelling to look at what this regulation will do and how they could harmonise it. So if you...
Yeah, and I think there's this regulation, it contains what was referred to as a mirror clause, which was part of this was very heavily lobbied regulation when it was going through the EU process. And part of that was because a lot of plastic things are actually imported from Asia and that, but the measures would apply equally to EU and to imported products. So therefore, a lot of GB manufacturers, they still have an interest in it, and they will likewise maybe lobby for alignment from that point of view.
Yeah, it's a response probably the committee's very familiar with, and that it's likely to happen. There's arguments why it would make sense for manufacturers and so on to try to adhere to the highest possible standards that do both. So we understand that, but yeah, it's still just unclear at the moment. Any other indications?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. You probably don't have the answer to this, but just one of the questions about, particularly with GB into NI. You're aware, of course, that we can put labelling on sort of GB coming into NI things not for resale in the EU. So therefore, if something was coming in that was very clearly not going to contaminate the single market, for want of better terminology, would that apply to those? Or would they still have to comply with the packaging rules and regulations, even though it quite categorically says on the packaging not for resale in the EU?
We probably don't know yet, because that level of information hasn't come out through the Delegated Act. So really, what's in the PPWR as it is now is sort of the high level ambition. So I don't think we can.
We understand that discussions in labelling, different the devolved governments that's on. Planned for 2025. So obviously we engage with that.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Could I ask before I start through you, Chair Clerk, has the department been given the appendix and suggested questions in relation to this item?
Not for this item, no. But we could certainly forward them. To
save me having to go through them, because they're all very good questions,
okay.
I would propose that we would send that on for answer. Could I ask just, obviously it's a significant piece of legislation, and we've received legal advice on that, and also reading through it ourselves, it's quite substantive. Is there an area of particular concern for the department in any of these specific policy intents, whether that be minimum recycled contact for plastic packaging, prohibition of certain types of single-use packaging, restriction on packaging size, chemical contact, go on. Is there any particular area that would cause you most concern?
Just to note that I suppose that it contains a mix of reserved and devolved areas.
But from a devolved perspective?
From our perspective, the chemicals and that's Food Standard Agency, so that wouldn't sit with us. So as Colin said, I think it's the general direction of travel for most, I think.
Yeah, certainly from the environmental standpoint, all saying the right things, all going in the right way. I suppose the main concern is that not fully understanding how all of these things will be implemented, exactly what the standards will be. The regulation is about 200 pages long. I'd imagine the implementing and delegated acts would be maybe another 1,000+ pages long for those 70 articles. So the not quite knowing exactly what all of these things will mean is the thing that always concerns me. You know, if I can read exactly what's going to apply, how it's going to apply, and how it will be done,
Yeah.
I'd understand it much better. Like, for example, recycled content, for example. Again, it's been the direction of travel of the UK government. They sort of led the way on that, the plastic packaging tax.
Mm-hmm.
The big difference being in the UK, you can pay the tax rather than have the recycled content in. Generally, the EU direction and things like that has been that you just have to get the recycled content in.
In a lot of these discussion points and the regulations that have come before the committee, it's largely been where we would look at Northern Ireland and say that they don't in themselves have producers that are supplying. This is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I accept that. Is there a breakdown, or can you get me a breakdown of those suppliers in GB that are supplying Northern Ireland vis-a-vis those Northern Ireland suppliers that are supplying Republic of Ireland, Europe, and into GB, for example? I'm just trying to work out. Obviously, it's not just the supplying of the material; it is also the very material that makes the product itself. So I'm just trying to get my head around. Obviously, it's significant. There's many differences in terms of some of the policy intent and how that would impact.
We wouldn't have that just at the moment,
Okay.
and then I suppose it's because there's further criteria and further, to come in detail in the implement access to the how you would calculate recycled content. So how, so before business will know what is the exact impact, or how many or who will be impacted.
And we'll have to see what exemptions there will be in
Yeah.
place for very small. Because I think,
There
in
has-
terms of some of the, the small item bans, I think there is an exemption mentioned in the regulations around very small operations
Yeah.
not having to do that. So it's very hard to work out exactly who will be impacted until you have the detail of exactly what material types it applies to, etc. We have a couple of reasonably large packaging manufacturers here. They will undoubtedly be affected, maybe positively, maybe negatively. There's a lot of positives out of this as well, because we have some of the most sustainable packaging makers in the world in this country as well.
I suppose probably we will draw that out probably through some of our representations with stakeholders, but it would just be important that where it is available, that the department perhaps feedback through yourselves to the committee as to what is the potential impacts, if the negative but also the positive, so that we can ascertain the overall scheme. The one thing that was interesting is a complete takeaway, excuse the pun, takeaway from it. The takeaway industry in itself, that seems quite different in terms of ensuring that there's the facility for reuse.
Yeah. So the option that you, the consumer shouldn't have to pay any more. I don't imagine they would charge more if you bring your own container. I think there's a focus on encouraging reuse within it. Although I think it's like 10%. I think it starts at a fairly low threshold in the beginning, and I suppose that's something as a direction of travel would be keen to promote.
How would that be enforced?
Well, again, that's in the detail yet to be determined. Yeah, I think there's I'm not up with the entire detail, but there is exemptions for smaller businesses too.
But if there was exemptions for smaller businesses, I would imagine most takeaways are in the category of small business.
Well, you may have, I suppose, chains, more larger retail chains of takeaway, so it might apply to them, but not necessarily to a small independent. I don't have all the detail yet.
Of that.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting one, because I think that could have a considerable communal impact on particularly those that are involved in the takeaway sector, with other pressures that they're facing. But whether or not there's a derogation in relation to that would be interesting for us to find. But anyway, the questions that we have will be submitted, and then we can take from there.
Any further indications? No. Then just remains me to thank you again for your attendance today and for your answers. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll just remind for me then as well to remind members that once the text has been published in the official journal, the committee may receive a notification from the British Government in relation to some or all of the Act under Article 13.3 of the Windsor Framework. The committee would then be required to make its decision on whether to conduct an inquiry. Moving to the next item of business correspondence. There are no items of correspondence. Chairperson's business was dealt with earlier. Any other business? Do members have any other business?
Yeah. Just as I said earlier in closed session, just be aware that I've been in communication with Lord Murphy, and sort of approaches about discussions about the Windsor Framework Committee. I just thought it would be useful as the committee knew that they were already reaching out to political parties on the role of this committee and also the whole review on the Windsor Framework.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we had some correspondence from the Speaker around that.
Yeah, we've also written to Secretary of State.
So then, if there's no other items of business, just remains to move to the date, time and place of the next meeting, to inform members of the committee that the next meeting has been scheduled for Thursday the 23rd of January 2025, 10 a.m. and here. And if members are happy, then that's just to adjourn the meeting. Adjourned. Thank you.
Committee Room 30. Sound.